He punched me in the stomach because I was breathing too loud. That's what I whispered to myself that night, clutching the edge of my worn couch with one hand and pressing the other against my aching belly, a belly that once carried him into this world, a belly that endured labor pains and sleepless nights, a belly he had now turned into his punching bag because my existence irritated him. I am 61 years old, a black woman who spent most of her life working double shifts as a nurse's aide, raising my only son with the belief that love, sacrifice, and endless patience would mold him into a decent man. Instead, I find myself trapped inside the very house I fought so hard to keep, reduced to silence in order to avoid another explosion, reduced to holding my breath so I wouldn't anger him again. The silence in the house that night was suffocating. He had slammed his bedroom door after the blow, muttering something about how I made his head hurt. And I sat in the dim light of the living room, listening to the sound of his heavy footsteps pacing back and forth above me. My stomach throbbed with each beat of my heart, a deep ache that carried more humiliation than physical pain. I kept hearing his voice echoing in my head, those careless words about my breathing, as if my right to take air into my lungs was too much for him to tolerate. I wanted to scream, to curse him, to remind him of the sacrifices I made when he was a child with asthma, when I rushed him to the ER in the middle of the night, when I sat beside his hospital bed, counting each one of his breaths, terrified of losing him. Now here I was, accused of breathing too loud, punished for existing in his space. I never imagined this would be my reality. I thought domestic violence was something that happened to other women, younger women, women with boyfriends or husbands who turned cruel after marriage. Nobody talks about the mothers who are battered by the children they raised, the hands that once clung to their skirts, now balled into fists that shatter ribs and silence voices. In church, they always tell us children are a blessing, a reward for faith and endurance. But what happens when your blessing becomes your burden? What happens when the son you poured your whole soul into becomes the man who sees you as disposable, a maid in your own home, a punching bag he can use whenever life disappoints him? I pressed a pillow against my abdomen, trying to steady my breathing so I wouldn't make another sound that could trigger him. And in that moment, I understood something chilling. This house, the house I bought 30 years ago with my late husband, had become my prison. Every picture on the wall reminded me of years of sacrifice. The graduation photo where he wore the cap and gown I paid for by working overtime. The birthday parties where I stretched my paycheck to make sure he had cake, gifts, balloons, while I ate rice and beans for weeks. The living room rug that I saved coupons for 6 months to afford, now stained by the dirt from his boots as he stormed in and out, barking orders like a king. My home was no longer mine. It belonged to his rage. I told myself maybe if I stayed quiet, morning would come and things would calm down. That's what I had done for months, maybe even years. Swallowed the insults, ignored the bruises, told neighbors I was clumsy, told doctors I slipped in the bathtub. But that night was different. Something about the absurdity of it all, the fact that a grown man could punch his 61-year-old mother for the crime of breathing, broke a part of me that had stayed strong for too long. I realized that silence wasn't protecting me. It was killing me. Every time I chose not to call for help, I was choosing to let him write the story of my life. And in his version, I was voiceless, powerless, invisible. I sat in that darkness thinking about all the women I had known through the years, women in their 50s and 60s who whispered their secrets to me in hospital hallways and church basements. They spoke about sons who stole their pension checks, daughters who left them to rot in nursing homes, grandsons who cursed them when the bills piled up. I used to listen with pity, thinking I would never let it go that far, that I would always be respected, because I had worked too hard and loved too fiercely. But here I was, a living example of the nightmare I once thought belonged to others. The fear sat heavy on my chest, but alongside it grew a sharp, unfamiliar anger. I thought of my own mother, a woman who survived segregation, who cleaned houses for white families that paid her pennies, who never stopped reminding me, "Baby, you better make sure you stand up for yourself, 'cause nobody else will." She didn't raise me to bow down to anyone, least of all my own child. My late husband's voice echoed too, the way he used to squeeze my hand and tell me, "You're stronger than you think, Renata. Don't ever let anybody forget it." Those voices joined together inside me, louder than my son's threats, louder than the pounding of my heart. The digital clock on the stove glowed 12:47 a.m. The night stretched out in front of me like a test I wasn't sure I would survive. I sat trembling with my phone in my hand, the screen lighting up my swollen face. Calling the police felt like betraying my own blood. But wasn't he the one who betrayed me first? Wasn't he the one who broke the bond between mother and child the moment his fist landed in my stomach? I thought about the women who would see me in church and say, "Sister Renata always keeps her head high." Would they still respect me if they knew the truth? I thought about the nurse at the clinic, who once asked me quietly if everything was okay at home, and how I smiled and lied. "I'm fine, just clumsy." What would she think if she knew I was bleeding inside because of my own son? The shame almost convinced me to put the phone down. But then the pain in my stomach pulsed like a reminder, and a thought flashed across my mind. If I keep quiet tonight, he might kill me tomorrow. That thought pierced through the fog of fear and hesitation. My thumb hovered over the numbers, my breath shaking. For the first time in my life, I wasn't dialing my sister, or a neighbor, or even the church prayer line. I was dialing 911. My voice cracked when the dispatcher answered, but I forced the words out anyway. "My son hit me. I need help." In that moment, I felt the strangest thing, a spark of power, the kind of power I hadn't felt in decades, since I was young and brave enough to believe I could take on the world. Maybe I was still that woman after all. Maybe, even at 61, even with bruises blooming on my skin, I still had the right to fight back. And as I sat in the silence, waiting for the sound of sirens to break the night, I promised myself one thing. This would be the last time he ever laid a hand on me without consequence. When the knock came at the door, it wasn't gentle or patient. It was the kind of pounding that rattled the thin glass panes and made my heart leap into my throat. A sound that promised authority, a sound my son had never expected to hear in the middle of the night. The red and blue lights were already flickering across the curtains when I shuffled toward the front hallway, my hand pressed to my stomach like I needed to hold myself together. I could hear the dispatcher's words still echoing in my ear. "Officers are on the way, ma'am. Stay safe. Stay on the line if you can." But I had hung up the phone because I didn't want my son to hear me talking. He had been quiet upstairs until that first heavy knock, and then I heard the quick thud of his footsteps across the floorboards, a bedroom door flying open, and his voice calling down in disbelief. "Who the hell is that at this hour?" I didn't answer him. I couldn't, because the words were stuck in my throat. But I kept walking toward the door, my fingers trembling against the chain lock. For years, this house had been a place where I feared his anger, but tonight it became the stage for something else, a reckoning I had never dared to imagine. When I pulled the door open, 2 uniformed officers stood there, one younger and one older, their eyes scanning me quickly, noting my posture, the way I cradled my midsection, the fear in my face. They asked me quietly if I was the caller, and all I could do was nod, because speaking the truth out loud still felt like climbing a mountain. Behind me, heavy footsteps pounded down the stairs, and my son appeared, his face flushed with anger and confusion, wearing nothing but sweatpants and that arrogant smirk that always made me feel small. "What's going on here? Why are the police at my house?" he demanded, his tone dripping with the entitlement of a man who has never been told no. He looked from me to the officers, as though this had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding he could smooth over with charm or intimidation. But when the older officer asked me directly, "Ma'am, do you feel unsafe tonight?" I finally found my voice. My lips trembled, but I said the words anyway. "Yes, I do." He hit me. The silence that followed was thick, and for a moment even my son froze, his jaw tightening as if he couldn't believe I had broken the unspoken rule of our household. Never expose what happens inside these walls. Then the denial began. "She's lying," he spat, his voice rising. "She's old. She's paranoid. She's making things up. I didn't touch her. She probably tripped over her own feet like she always does." He laughed bitterly, trying to turn my truth into a joke, trying to paint me as senile or unstable, the way abusers often do. I stood there, shaking, wondering if the officers would believe me, or if I would be left alone with him after daring to call for help. But the younger officer's gaze flickered to the way I was holding my stomach, to the faint bruise already darkening near my ribs, and his face hardened. He asked me if I needed medical attention, and when I nodded, he turned to my son and said firmly, "Sir, step back and place your hands behind your back." The sound of the cuffs snapping shut was like thunder rolling through the house, louder than any storm I had ever known. My son shouted, cursed, twisted his body as though he could fight his way out of accountability, but the officers held him steady, reading him his rights in a calm, unshakable tone. He screamed my name, accusing me of betrayal, swearing that I would regret this, that no one would believe an old woman over him. But his words no longer pierced me the way they once did. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking in fear. I was standing still, rooted in something firmer than his rage, something that felt like the ground finally steady beneath my feet. As they led him out of the front door, the neighborhood came alive. Porch lights flicked on. Blinds shifted as curious eyes peered through narrow slits. For months, maybe years, they must have heard the yelling, the slammed doors, the crashes of dishes against walls, but no one had ever come knocking before. Now, as the police car idled in front of my home, neighbors whispered and stared, their shadows long in the flashing lights. Shame tried to crawl up my throat again, but I swallowed it down. This wasn't my shame to carry anymore. Inside the house, the silence after his departure felt almost unreal, like stepping into a world that had been reset. The officers asked me again if I needed an ambulance, and I told them yes. My stomach hurt too much to ignore. They offered me water, helped me sit down on the couch, their voices steady and professional, but I could feel the compassion beneath their questions. One of them explained that my son would spend the night in custody, that a report would be filed, that I had the right to press charges, to request a protective order, to finally draw a line between myself and his violence. Listening to those words, I felt both terrified and relieved. Terrified because I knew he would come back angrier than ever once he was released. Relieved because I finally had people on my side, people who could see me not as a burden, but as a victim of a crime. As the ambulance arrived, its lights painting the street in another layer of red, I lay back on the stretcher and closed my eyes. The straps across my chest and waist felt less like restraints and more like anchors, holding me together after years of falling apart. I heard my son's voice fading in the distance, muffled through the patrol car window, still cursing me, still insisting on his innocence. But it no longer carried the same weight. His words were just noise, like the echo of a storm that had already passed. At the hospital, as the doctors examined my bruises and documented every mark, I felt exposed and vulnerable, but also strangely validated. The photographs they took, the questions they asked, the notes they scribbled into charts, all of it was proof that my pain wasn't invisible anymore. A social worker sat beside me, her voice soft but firm, telling me about shelters, legal aid, counseling, and for the first time in years, I realized that my life could still change. I didn't have to keep living in fear, waiting for the next blow. And yet, lying in that hospital bed with the antiseptic smell sharp in my nostrils and the fluorescent lights burning above me, I also felt grief. Grief for the son I once knew, the boy I cradled when he had nightmares, the boy whose asthma inhaler I carried everywhere, the boy who used to whisper, "I love you, Mama," before running off to school. That boy was gone, replaced by a man consumed with anger and entitlement. But alongside the grief was a growing flame of resolve. If he could destroy the bond between us with his fists, then I could rebuild my life without him, brick by brick, even if I had to do it alone. By the time dawn crept through the hospital blinds, turning the sky a muted grey, I had already decided I wasn't going back to silence. The knock on my door had been more than police arriving. It had been a signal, a catalyst, the beginning of something I never thought I would dare to start. The world had shifted, and so had I. The chain of fear had been broken, and though I still carried bruises on my skin, I finally breathed without apology. Under the pale hospital lights, with the dull ache in my abdomen spreading like a shadow, I began to understand that calling the police was only the first step, and the real storm was yet to come. When morning arrived and the doctors cleared me for discharge, a social worker walked me through paperwork I could barely focus on, papers about pressing charges, about protective orders, about resources for women who had endured abuse. My hand trembled over every signature line because I knew that each stroke of my pen was not just about protecting myself, but about turning my back on the son I had raised. The son I once believed would hold my hand in my old age. By the time I returned home, escorted by an officer who insisted on checking the locks, my phone was already buzzing with calls from numbers I knew too well. His wife, his cousin, his friends, who always looked at me with polite smiles while ignoring the tension in my house. They all wanted to know why I had gone so far, why I had called the cops on my own flesh and blood, why I couldn't just handle things privately like family should. The first message I actually listened to came from his wife, her voice syrupy, with false sweetness, but the bitterness cut through every word. "Mama, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to drop this. You're ruining everything. Do you want to destroy his career? Do you want him to lose his job? Do you want to be the reason your grandkids grow up without their father? Think about what you're doing." Her words twisted in my gut because she knew exactly which strings to pull, the strings of guilt and shame, the ones tied to every sacrifice I ever made for the idea of family. She wanted me to believe I was the problem, that my refusal to remain silent was the true violence, not his fists, not his insults, not his control over my pension checks and my daily life. As I sat on my couch listening to those voicemails pile up, I felt the air in the house turn heavy, almost poisonous, because this wasn't just about my son anymore. This was about a web of people invested in keeping me quiet. His wife, who depended on his paycheck and the illusion of a perfect marriage. His friends, who enjoyed his charm at cookouts, but never asked why I looked so tired. Even relatives who had taken my money over the years, who had watched me stretch myself thin, now called and whispered that I should forgive and forget. It was as if everyone believed that a black mother's role was to endure, to carry the pain without complaint, to keep the family together no matter the cost to her body or her dignity. The pressure mounted quickly. The very next evening, after he was released on bail, he called me from his cousin's phone. His voice was calmer than I expected, but it carried that familiar edge of menace, the tone he always used when he wanted me to back down. "Mama, I don't know why you did this, but it's not too late to fix it. You can go down to the station and tell them you overreacted, that you were confused, that you're not pressing charges. If you don't, this is going to get ugly. You don't want that, do you?" His words slithered through the receiver, filling my ears with the same fear that had kept me silent for so long. He sounded less like a son and more like a man who believed he owned me, who believed my age, my loneliness, my financial vulnerability made me his possession. I hung up without responding, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the phone onto the floor. For a long time, I stared at it where it lay against the rug, as if it were a weapon I didn't know how to handle. Every instinct in me screamed to protect myself by giving in, by withdrawing the complaint, by pretending it never happened. That's what so many women in my shoes had done, and I understood why. The weight of community judgment, the fear of retaliation, the aching hope that maybe he would change if given another chance. Those forces were stronger than fists sometimes, but another voice inside me, small but steady, told me I couldn't keep living like this. The next day, I went to the courthouse to apply for a protective order. The clerk, a woman not much younger than my son, handed me forms and asked me to describe the incident in writing. My hands stiffened as I wrote the words, "He punched me in the stomach because I was breathing too loud," the absurdity of it glaring back at me in ink. It looked almost unreal on the page, like something out of a cruel story, but the pain in my body told me it was truth. While I filled out the details, the date, the time, the way I called 911, the officers who responded, I felt a strange shift inside me, as though I was reclaiming the narrative of my life, one line at a time. When I returned home that afternoon, there were 3 people waiting on my porch: his wife, her sister, and a cousin I hadn't seen in years. Their faces were tight with accusation, their voices rising as soon as I stepped out of the taxi. "You're tearing this family apart," the cousin snapped. "What kind of mother calls the police on her own son?" "Do you know what people are saying? Do you know what this will do to our name?" His wife chimed in, tears in her eyes but venom in her tone. "You're sick, Mama. You need help. Nobody hits their mama. You must have imagined it. Maybe you fell. Maybe you're confused. Please, just drop it." I stood there on the porch, clutching my purse, listening to them twist reality as though gaslighting me could erase the bruise still dark across my stomach. For a moment, their voices nearly drowned out my resolve. I almost believed them, almost wondered if I was crazy, if I had imagined the violence, if I was overreacting. But then I remembered the sound of his fist connecting with my body, the pain that made me double over, the humiliation of knowing he felt justified. That memory anchored me. "He hit me," I said softly but firmly. I didn't imagine it. I didn't fall. He hit me, and I'm not taking it back. Their faces twisted with frustration, and one by one they turned away, muttering about betrayal, about shame, about how I had chosen strangers over my own blood. Watching them walk down my front steps, I felt the loneliness crash over me, heavier than any blow. Because standing up meant standing alone, at least for now. But it also meant choosing myself, maybe for the first time in decades. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the protective order paperwork, the pamphlets the social worker had given me, and the photographs of my bruises tucked into a manila folder. The silence in the house was sharp, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of aftermath, the silence that comes after the first shot in a long battle. I realized that this was just the beginning. My son would not let go easily, his wife would not stop pressuring me, and the family would not stop calling me a traitor. The real escalation had already begun, and it would not stop until either he broke me back into silence or I found the strength to expose him fully. As the clock struck midnight, I whispered a prayer my mother used to say when life cornered her. Lord, give me the strength to stand, even if I stand alone. And with that, I knew the path forward was set. By the time the court date for the temporary protective order arrived, I felt like weeks had passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and sleepless nights filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Every morning, I woke with the same knot in my stomach, not just from the bruise that still pulsed with a dull ache, but from the dread of what might come next. And yet every evening I reminded myself that I had already taken the step most mothers in. My situation never dared to take. I had named my son as my abuser. I had spoken the unspeakable. And now there was no turning back. The courthouse was cold and impersonal, the kind of place where lives are weighed and measured by strangers who see suffering every day. And as I sat on the wooden bench clutching my file of evidence, the police report, the medical photographs, the notes from the social worker, I felt both small and powerful at the same time, a contradiction that seemed to define my entire life. When the clerk called my name and I walked into the hearing room, I expected to see my son looking contrite, maybe embarrassed, maybe even apologetic. But instead he sat at the table with his lawyer, his posture relaxed, his expression a mask of arrogance that I knew too well. He didn't glance at me, didn't acknowledge the woman who had carried him in her body, raised him through sickness and struggle, worked double shifts to put food on the table, and paid for his schooling when there was no money to spare. To him, I was no longer his mother, but his opponent, the person standing in the way of his freedom, his reputation, and his control. His lawyer, a sharp man in a navy suit, began speaking before I could even take my seat, painting me as an unstable, aging woman who had become confused and bitter, who had fabricated violence to punish her son for moving on with his life. And the words cut deeper than any bruise because they were designed to erase me, to reduce me to a stereotype. A crazy old black woman who couldn't tell reality from imagination. I felt the judge's eyes on me, calm but assessing, and I forced myself to breathe steadily, to remind myself that I had proof, that this wasn't just my word against his. When it was my turn to speak, my voice shook at first, but then it grew steadier as I described the night he hit me, the absurd accusation about my breathing, the way I called 911 while curled up in pain, the officers who found me trembling by the door. I handed over the photographs of my injuries, each one taken under the harsh hospital light, each one a testament to what my body had endured. The judge flipped through them slowly, and I watched my son shift in his seat, his jaw tightening, his bravado faltering for just a second. And in that flicker, I saw the truth. He knew he was guilty, and his rage came not from innocence, but from the fear of being exposed. The judge granted the temporary order, forbidding him from coming near me or the house, and though it was only a piece of paper, when I held the copy in my hands, it felt like a shield, fragile, but real. Outside the courthouse, I expected relief, but instead, I was met by his wife, who had waited in the parking lot with her arms crossed and her face twisted in a mixture of fury and desperation. She didn't shout. She didn't curse. Instead, she leaned close and hissed words meant to slice quietly into my heart. "You think you've won something, but you've only made things worse. He's going to lose his job, Mama. We won't be able to pay the bills. People will look at you like you're the villain. You can't survive alone. Drop this before it destroys us all." Her eyes glistened with tears. But they weren't for me, and they weren't for justice. They were for her own comfort, her own fear of losing the lifestyle built on my silence. That confrontation lingered with me as the days passed, and I felt myself pulled between two powerful forces: the weight of my love for my son, the memories of the boy he once was, and the undeniable reality of the man he had become. A man who thought nothing of raising his fist against me. It was in this tension that the midpoint of my journey revealed itself, because I realized I was no longer just reacting to his violence, no longer just surviving from one outburst to the next. I was actively building a case, gathering allies, and preparing for a future where I might finally be free. The social worker connected me with an advocate from a local women's centre, and she came to my house with forms and resources, sitting at my kitchen table like a sister who had walked this path before. She told me stories of women in their 60s, women with grey hair and swollen joints, who had faced the same cruelty from children they had raised. And for the first time, I did not feel like an anomaly. I felt like part of a hidden community of mothers who had carried their children into adulthood, only to be repaid with contempt. Together, we catalogued every piece of evidence I had: the medical records, the voicemail messages where his wife pressured me to stay silent, the notes from neighbours who had heard shouting on countless nights. Each document was another brick in the wall I was building between myself and his power, and each step strengthened my resolve. Yet the more I built, the more resistance grew. Anonymous calls began late at night, voices telling me I was evil, that I was destroying my own bloodline, that I was cursed for betraying my family. At church, I felt eyes on me, whispers behind my back, older women telling me softly that maybe I should forgive, that a son is a son, no matter what he does. The isolation was sharp, but it also clarified something for me. I could not count on the approval of others. I could only count on the truth. One evening, as I was sorting through documents, there was a knock at my door that sent chills down my spine. When I opened it, I found my neighbour standing there, a woman I had known casually for years, holding a small flash drive in her hand. She explained that her security camera, which overlooked the street, had captured footage of my son storming into the house on the night of the attack. And though it hadn't caught the punch itself, it recorded the moments after, showing me doubled, over, clutching my stomach, calling for help, while he paced in the doorway shouting. She pressed the drive into my hand and said simply, "You'll need this." In that moment, I felt the scales shift again, because now it wasn't just my voice. It wasn't just my body bearing the proof. I had eyes from the outside, an impartial witness that technology had gifted me. Holding that tiny piece of plastic, I realized that the midpoint of this story was not just about surviving the immediate violence, but about reaching the moment when the balance of power began to tilt. For so long, my son had thrived on secrecy, on the assumption that no one would believe me, that my age and my race and my vulnerability would erase my credibility. But now, with evidence stacking in my favor, with allies forming around me, I could see the possibility of victory. It terrified me as much as it exhilarated me, because I knew the backlash would grow fiercer. But I also knew that I could not retreat. That night, lying in my bed, with the protective order taped to my nightstand and the flash drive hidden in a drawer, I whispered to myself words I hadn't dared speak in years. I will not be silenced. The midpoint was not relief. It was not triumph, but it was the shift from fear to strategy, from surviving to fighting. And though the road ahead promised more betrayal, more pain, and more confrontation, I knew I had crossed a threshold I could never uncross. The mother who endured in silence was gone, and in her place stood a woman who would demand justice, even if it meant standing alone in the storm. I thought the small victories I had gathered would begin to steady the ground under my feet. But what I did not anticipate was the way the system itself could bend in his favor once he decided to fight back with every weapon he had. It began with a letter delivered to my home, thick paper folded into an envelope stamped with the name of his lawyer, the same man who had sat beside him in court with a smirk that said he already knew how this game was played. Inside were documents accusing me of instability, of delusion, of being unfit to manage my own affairs. They called it a petition for guardianship, suggesting that my mind was slipping, that age and stress had made me confused, that I was imagining violence where none existed. Reading those words was like being slapped in the face, harder than any blow I had endured, because now my son was not just denying what he had done. He was rewriting reality so thoroughly that he wanted the law to strip me of my independence altogether. The shock rolled through me like a wave I could not stand against. For decades, I had prided myself on managing my life, on paying bills on time, on keeping this house afloat even after my husband passed, on making sure my son never went without. Now here I was, 61 years old, with paperwork in my hands that claimed I was incapable of caring for myself, as though my lifetime of labor and sacrifice could be erased with a few paragraphs typed by a lawyer. Worse still, I knew this was not just his idea. It had the fingerprints of his wife all over it. That young woman who had once called me Mama with a sweet smile and now treated me like an obstacle to be pushed aside. I could hear her voice in the phrasing, in the accusation that I was confused and combative, that I had irrationally involved police in a family matter. They were laying the groundwork to discredit me, to take control of my money, my house, even my body if I let them. When I showed the letter to the advocate from the Women's Centre, her face tightened with concern. But she wasn't surprised. She told me this was a common tactic, that abusers often tried to paint their victims as unstable, especially when the victim was an older woman, especially when she was black, because the world was already primed to believe we were fragile, hysterical, prone to exaggeration. Hearing her say it out loud both comforted and enraged me. Comforted because it meant I wasn't alone, that this was part of a pattern many others had faced, but enraged because it showed how easy it was for the truth to be twisted, how quickly my years of survival could be spun into a story of weakness. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest I had known. Friends who had once offered sympathetic nods in church now avoided my eyes, whispers about my mental state weaving through the congregation. Neighbours who had seen the police cars outside my house shook their heads as though they weren't sure what to believe. Even a cousin I had once lent money to called and said, "Maybe you should just let it go. You don't want people thinking you've lost it." The betrayal of community cut deeper than I could have imagined, because it reminded me that the fight I was waging wasn't only against my son, but against a culture that still expected me to bear everything in silence. At the preliminary hearing for the guardianship petition, I sat at the table with my advocate beside me, my documents spread out, while across the room, my son and his lawyer spoke with confidence about my supposed decline. They described me as forgetful, paranoid, emotionally unstable. They produced witnesses, his wife, his friend, even a distant relative. who testified that I often misunderstood situations, that I was prone to overreacting, that I imagined threats where none existed, each lie layered over the last until I felt the walls closing in, until I wondered whether the judge could see through the performance or whether the truth would be buried beneath their rehearsed concern. My son sat there with his hands folded, nodding solemnly, his face painted with the mask of a dutiful child who only wanted to help his poor, confused mother. And the sight of it nearly broke me. When my turn came to speak, I forced my voice to remain steady as I described my life in detail, the years of managing bills, the clear records of my finances, the police report and medical evidence that proved the abuse had happened. I spoke of my work history, of my ability to care for myself, of the absurdity of suggesting that I was incapable now. The judge listened quietly, his expression unreadable, and in that silence I felt the cruel uncertainty of justice. Because even with the truth in my hands, even with bruises still faintly visible on my skin, the narrative being spun against me had weight, and I knew the danger was real. Walking out of that courtroom, the air felt heavy, like the walls of the city were leaning in on me. The protective order was still in place, but the guardianship petition meant the battle had shifted to a new field, one where perception mattered as much as fact. My son's strategy was clear. If he couldn't silence me through fear, he would silence me through the law, through the stripping away of my credibility, through the suggestion that I was unfit to speak for myself. And the cruelest part was how easily the world was willing to believe him, how quickly people were prepared to erase the voice of a 61-year-old black woman who dared to tell the truth about her own child. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I stared at the stack of papers until my eyes blurred with tears, and I realized this was the cruel twist I hadn't anticipated. Not just fighting my son's fists, but fighting the system he had weaponized against me. The injustice of it pressed down on me like a weight I could barely carry. But somewhere beneath the fear, another flame burned. If they wanted to paint me as unstable, then I would show them my clarity. If they wanted to strip me of my independence, then I would prove how fiercely I could stand. And as the clock ticked past midnight, I whispered to myself that the fight was not over, that the cruelty of this turn would not be the end of my story, but the fire that carried me into the next battle. The weeks following that courtroom ambush stretched into a kind of purgatory, every day marked by the tension between my small victories and the looming threat of being declared incapable of running my own life. I tried to move through my routines as normally as possible, making coffee in the morning, watering the plants on the porch, sorting laundry that no one but me would ever wear. But every action felt shadowed by the knowledge that my son and his lawyer were working behind the scenes to discredit me. The phone calls kept coming, not as frantic as before, but quieter, more insidious. His wife would leave long voicemails laced with false concern, telling me she was worried about my mental state, insisting that I needed professional help, promising that everything would be easier if I just let them take care of the bills and the decisions. I deleted each one, but the words echoed in my mind long after the phone had gone silent, because I knew she wasn't talking to me alone. She was planting a narrative that she expected the world to believe. The isolation deepened. Friends from church, once warm and supportive, now greeted me with careful politeness, as though they didn't want to be caught taking sides. A few whispered their support in private, saying they believed me, but their words were always followed by, "I just can't get involved." Even neighbors who had witnessed shouting matches through the walls chose to look away. It was as though the community had silently agreed that the spectacle was too uncomfortable, that the safe choice was to pretend nothing was happening. Each time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, judging whether I was walking steadily enough, speaking clearly enough, smiling enough to pass as sane. It was a strange kind of surveillance, one I couldn't escape. And I began to understand that the fight wasn't just in the courtroom, but in every interaction, every glance, every whisper. Yet even in the middle of that suffocating loneliness, small cracks of light appeared. The neighbor who had given me the flash drive knocked on my door again, this time carrying a printed statement she had written out, detailing the sounds she had heard and the video she had captured. She told me she was willing to testify if it came to that, her eyes firm with the kind of quiet courage I had almost forgotten existed. I wanted to hug her, to cry in her arms, but instead I thanked her with a trembling voice, overwhelmed by the realization that not everyone had abandoned me. Later that week, the advocate from the Women's Centre connected me with a legal aid attorney who specialized in cases like mine. And for the first time, I sat across the table from someone who knew exactly how the system could be twisted against older women and how to fight back. She explained the steps we would take, the evidence we needed, the way we could use the protective order, the police report, and the medical records to counter the guardianship petition. Her confidence steadied me, even as fear continued to gnaw at the edges of my resolve. But my son was not done escalating. When intimidation and legal maneuvering didn't silence me, he turned to financial sabotage. One morning, I discovered that my bank account had been flagged for unusual activity, and when I spoke with the branch manager, he explained that someone had tried to access my funds using my personal information. The attempt had been blocked, but the implication was clear. He was trying to drain the resources I needed to fight him. The thought of my own child stealing not just my peace but my future made me feel sick. I spent that afternoon at the bank freezing my accounts, setting up new protections, realizing with each form I signed that I could no longer trust him with anything, not even the remnants of the trust we had once shared. At the same time, his wife launched a campaign online, posting carefully worded messages about how mental health in our elders is something we must all be vigilant about. She never mentioned my name, but the implication was obvious to anyone who knew us. She painted herself and my son as the concerned caretakers of a woman losing her grip on reality, a woman who lashed out with false accusations. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, because it wasn't just a personal attack. It was an erasure of my truth in the most public way possible. Strangers commented with sympathy for her, calling her brave, calling my son patient, and each word felt like a nail hammered into the coffin they were building for my reputation. The weight of it all pressed down on me until I could barely sleep. I would lie awake in the early hours of the morning, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made a mistake, if the cost of standing up for myself would ultimately crush me. But then I would remember the sound of his fist, the ache in my stomach, the way I had doubled over gasping for air while he looked at me like I was nothing more than an irritation. That memory reignited my anger, and it reminded me why I had taken this path in the first place. Survival was no longer enough. I wanted accountability, I wanted justice, and I wanted freedom from the chains he had wrapped around my life. The second escalation reached its peak when my attorney called me one evening with a discovery. Through her own digging, she had uncovered discrepancies in my son's financial records, irregularities in the accounts he managed for work, and a trail that suggested he had been using my pension funds not just for personal expenses, but as collateral for risky ventures. The revelation hit me like a storm because it explained so much. The constant pressure to keep me silent, the desperation to control my finances, the sudden intensity of his attacks when I started asking questions. He wasn't just an abusive son. He was a man drowning in secrets, terrified that exposure of one crime would unravel them all. That knowledge, bitter as it was, gave me a new kind of strength. I wasn't fighting only for my dignity anymore. I was fighting to reveal the truth of who he had become, and the evidence was finally on my side. As I sat in my living room that night, the documents spread out before me, I felt the shift again. The first escalation had been about surviving his threats. The midpoint had been about gathering strength. But now the escalation had transformed into a full confrontation, a war that would be waged in courtrooms, in bank offices, in the very narrative of my life. He thought he could bury me under lies, strip me of my voice, erase my autonomy. But with every attack, he only revealed more of himself. And with every revelation, I felt the fire inside me grow hotter. I no longer prayed simply for protection. I prayed for endurance, for clarity, for the will to keep pushing until the truth broke through. When the clock struck midnight and I finally turned off the lamp, I whispered into the quiet house that I was ready. Ready for the fight, ready for the judgment, ready for whatever storm he thought he could bring against me. Because the second escalation, as terrifying as it had been, had shown me something essential. I was not broken, I was sharpened. And the woman he thought he could silence was no longer willing to bend. The day of the full hearing arrived like a storm I had felt rumbling on the horizon for weeks, every gust of wind carrying whispers of doubt, and every clap of thunder reminding me of the violence that had set this battle in motion. I woke before dawn, the house wrapped in silence so heavy I could almost hear my own heartbeat echoing in the walls. And I dressed carefully, not in anything extravagant, but in clothes that made me feel steady and strong. I pinned back my hair, smoothed my blouse, and slipped the folder of evidence into my bag with hands that trembled slightly, but no longer shook with fear alone. By the time my advocate arrived to drive me to the courthouse, the morning sun had just begun to stretch across the sky, and as I stepped onto the porch, I told myself that I would not walk back into this house the same way I was leaving it. Something had to change today. The courthouse was crowded, its hallways buzzing with voices and footsteps, but inside the hearing room the air was tense, thick with the kind of anticipation that made every chair creak, sound like a drumbeat. My son sat at the table with his lawyer, his posture relaxed, but his eyes hard and unyielding. And when he glanced at me, there was no trace of remorse, only the cold fury of a man who believed he was entitled to win. His wife sat behind him, clutching her purse with white knuckles, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. And I realized that she too had staked her future on this performance, that for her, my silence was the foundation of the life she wanted to keep. Across the aisle, I sat with my attorney and the advocate, their presence steadying me even as the weight of the room pressed down on my shoulders. The proceedings began with his lawyer, who launched into a rehearsed argument about my supposed instability. He spoke of confusion, of paranoia, of imagined threats, painting me as a woman slipping into dementia, a woman whose accusations were born not of truth, but of delusion. Witnesses stepped forward, his wife, a cousin, a friend, each one reciting lines about how I had become forgetful, about how I misunderstood conversations, about how my behavior had grown erratic. Their voices were smooth, their faces carefully arranged, and for a moment I felt myself shrinking under the barrage, wondering if the judge could see through the performance, or if the web of lies would tighten around me until I suffocated. But then it was our turn. My attorney rose and spoke with a calm authority that filled the room, laying out the timeline of events, the police report, the medical records, the photographs of my bruises. She presented the protective order already granted, reminding the court that a judge had found sufficient cause to believe I was in danger. And then she introduced the flash drive, the video captured by my neighbor's security camera, and the room shifted. The screen flickered to life, showing the grainy footage of my son storming into the house, the shouting that carried into the night, the moment I stumbled into the doorway clutching my stomach, my body bent with pain, my voice thin as I spoke into the phone calling for help. It wasn't the entire story, but it was enough, a fragment of truth too vivid to dismiss. The judge leaned forward, watching closely, and in that silence I felt the tide turning. My son shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his mask of confidence slipping as the evidence played out for everyone to see. His lawyer tried to object, tried to argue that the footage was inconclusive, but the damage had been done. The image of me doubled over, calling for help, carried more weight than any carefully rehearsed testimony against me. When I was called to the stand, I walked with slow, steady steps, my heart pounding but my voice clear. I spoke of the years of sacrifice, the decades of labor, the loneliness of widowhood, the way I had opened my home and my bank account to my son out of love, only to be repaid with cruelty. I described the night of the attack, the pain in my stomach, the shame of realizing that my own child saw me not as a mother, but as an object he could control. I did not cry, though my throat burned. I let the truth speak through me like a current that had been waiting too long to be released. The cross-examination was brutal. His lawyer tried to twist my words, tried to make me stumble, tried to suggest that I was exaggerating, that I had provoked my son, that perhaps I had fallen and invented a story out of confusion. But each time he pressed, I returned to the same steady answer. He hit me. The simplicity of those words cut through his strategies, because there was no way to soften them, no way to dress them up as misunderstanding. My truth was blunt, and in its bluntness it was unshakable. When my son himself took the stand, he tried to reclaim the narrative with charm, speaking softly about his concern for me, painting himself as the patient son who had only ever wanted to care for a mother too stubborn to accept help. He denied the violence with a smoothness that might have convinced strangers, but the cracks showed when he grew defensive, when his voice rose a little too sharply, when he snapped at a question from my attorney. The mask slipped further when the financial discrepancies were introduced. Documents showing irregularities in his accounts, questions about funds that had vanished from my pension, the lavish purchases he could not explain. Suddenly, the courtroom was not only looking at me for instability, but at him for dishonesty, and I saw the shift ripple across the room like a current of electricity. The climax built slowly but powerfully, each piece of evidence stacking upon the next until the weight was undeniable. By the time the closing arguments were made, the courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that comes when everyone knows the truth has surfaced and cannot be pushed back under. The judge's words were measured, deliberate, but when the decision was announced, it was like a hammer striking iron. The protective order was upheld, the guardianship petition was denied, and the evidence of financial misconduct would be referred for further investigation. My son's face drained of color, his jaw clenched, his hands tightening on the edge of the table, but I did not look away. For the first time in years, I met his gaze without flinching, and I saw not the boy I had raised, but the man he had become, a man stripped of the illusions he had built on my silence. As the gavel struck and the room began to stir, I sat back in my chair, my body trembling with exhaustion, but my spirit burning with something I had not felt in years. Triumph. It was not joy. It was not relief. It was the hard, raw satisfaction of surviving a storm and standing tall in its aftermath. The battle was not over. The road ahead would still be long. But the culmination of all the fear, all the pain, all the betrayal had led to this moment. And in this moment, I was not a victim, not a confused old woman, not a shadow in my own life. I was a mother who had spoken the truth, a woman who had fought back, and a survivor who had refused to be silenced. When the courtroom emptied and the weight of the judge's decision settled into my bones, I walked out into the late afternoon air, feeling as though I had stepped into another lifetime. The world outside looked the same. Cars rolling down the street, pigeons fluttering from the courthouse steps, people talking on their phones as if nothing had shifted. But inside me, everything was different. For the first time in years, I was not looking over my shoulder waiting for the next explosion, not calculating every breath to keep from angering someone who believed he had the right to control me. I carried no illusions that the battle was over, because wounds like these do not vanish with a single ruling. But I carried something else instead. The certainty that I had taken my life back, piece by piece, and that no one, not even the child I had birthed, would ever silence me again. The days that followed were strange, filled with a quiet I had almost forgotten how to live with. The house seemed larger somehow, its walls no longer echoing with his footsteps or his voice barking orders from upstairs. At first, the silence was unsettling, a reminder of the absence of the boy I had raised, but soon it began to feel like a balm, a space where I could hear my own thoughts without interruption. I walked through each room, touching the furniture, the photographs, the little relics of a life I had built, and I realized that these things no longer belonged to him. They belonged to me again. For so long I had moved like a guest in my own home, tiptoeing around his moods. But now I breathed fully, deeply, without fear of being told it was too loud. Friends and neighbours began to stop by, some cautiously at first, offering awkward smiles and half-hearted apologies for doubting me. I accepted their visits without bitterness, though I did not forget the silence that had surrounded me when I needed them most. I understood something now. People often choose comfort over truth, and it was easier for them to believe I was unstable than to face the reality of a son who could hit his mother. I no longer sought their approval, but I welcomed the company when it came with sincerity. The neighbour who had given me the video became a true friend, visiting often, bringing me soup and stories, reminding me that not everyone had turned away. Financially, there was still a storm to weather. Investigators began looking into the discrepancies in my son's accounts, and though it might take months or even years for justice to be served on that front, I no longer felt powerless. I sat with the bank manager and reset every account, cut off every access he had once demanded, and for the first time in years, my pension check came directly to me. The simple act of holding that money, my money, in my own hands, filled me with a pride I hadn't felt since my working days. It wasn't wealth, but it was independence, and independence was priceless. I made lists of repairs for the house, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, and every nail hammered, every coat of paint, every small fix was a declaration that this was my home, not his fortress. Spiritually, the journey was heavier. I wrestled with grief for the son I had lost, not through death, but through the choices he had made. I thought often of the boy who once clung to my arm when he was frightened, the boy who whispered, "I love you," as he drifted to sleep, and I mourned him as surely as if he had been buried. In his place was a man who saw me as a possession, a barrier, an enemy, and I had to accept that no court ruling could bring the child I once knew back to me. Forgiveness felt impossible, and maybe it would never come, but I did not let that stop me from moving forward. I prayed not for him, but for myself, for peace, for strength, for the courage to live the years I had left on my own terms. One Sunday morning, I walked into church, not sure how people would receive me, but determined to reclaim the space that had once been my sanctuary. The whispers rose, the curious glances darted my way, but I kept my head high. When the choir began to sing, the sound filled me with something I hadn't felt in so long. Release. Tears slid down my cheeks as I stood there, not from sadness, but from relief. because I realized I had made it through the fire, and I was still standing. After the service, an older woman I barely knew came up to me and pressed my hands in hers. She whispered, "You gave me courage. I've been keeping quiet for too long." In her eyes, I saw the reflection of my own journey, and I understood then that my fight had never been only mine. By refusing to stay silent, I had opened a door for others, women who carried bruises beneath long sleeves and secrets locked in their throats. As weeks turned into months, I rebuilt my routines not around fear, but around choice. I joined a support group for women my age who had endured abuse, and there I found sisters who understood every nuance of my pain without explanation. We shared stories, tears, and laughter, and together we stitched back pieces of ourselves we thought were gone forever. I began to cook again, not rushed meals thrown together to avoid his complaints, but slow, nourishing dishes that reminded me of my mother's kitchen. I tended the small garden in the yard, watching tomatoes ripen and flowers bloom, and each harvest felt like proof that life could grow again, even in soil that had been trampled. Every night before bed, I would walk through the house turning off the lights, pausing in the doorway of the room that had once been his. At first it hurt to see it empty, but slowly the emptiness became comforting, a reminder that I was free from his presence, free from his violence, free to breathe without fear. I had thought the culmination of my journey would be the court's decision, but the true resolution was here, in the quiet moments, in the reclaiming of ordinary life. The resolution was waking up without dread, eating breakfast in peace, answering the phone without bracing for threats. I do not fool myself into believing the scars will fade quickly. The bruise on my stomach healed, but the deeper wounds linger, the betrayal, the humiliation, the loneliness. Yet even those scars feel different now, less like chains and more like badges of survival. They remind me of what I endured and of what I overcame. They remind me that silence would have been the greater wound, the one that never healed. By choosing to speak, to fight, to expose the truth, I chose life, and that choice has reshaped everything. Now, when I sit on the porch in the evening, the sun sinking low and the cicadas humming in the trees, I let myself breathe as loudly as I want. Each breath is a declaration, each inhale and exhale a song of defiance. My son may never accept the truth, and the world may never fully understand the cost of what I lived through, but I do not need their validation anymore. I know who I am, a black woman who worked, sacrificed, endured, and finally rose. I am not a victim, but a survivor, not a shadow, but a voice, and I will spend the rest of my days living in the light of that truth.